Greetings and salutations. Welcome everyone to Catalyst Energies. My name is Dee. Thank you for joining me. I'm so grateful that you are here for this Catalyst full moon forecast. We have a Capricorn full moon coming up actually this evening. It is the 29th of June, 2026, and we're going to be talking, of course, about the full moon and all of the astrological transits and the astrological themes that are going to be present over the next 2 weeks. So from the full moon and then all the way out to our next new moon, which will actually be on July 14th. So first and foremost, welcome to everyone. Special shout out to Catalyst membership. Thank you for everything that you do. Without your contribution and in your investment, not only in Catalyst Energies and me doing the work, the investment in yourself to have consistent readings and check-ins and everything that goes along with a consistent membership to a platform such as this. So welcome. And of course, to my subscribers, welcome. Thank you for being here. Thank you for subscribing to this channel, being consistent, interacting with the content. It really does help a lot. And if you're new here, welcome. Thank you for being here. And as always, if you interact with this content by subscribing, liking, commenting, sharing, it actually does help this channel grow and get to a wider audience. I am unmonetized, and I actually want to keep it that way. These are my offerings to the community and to let people know about the work that I do. And if they want to be involved in a much more focused area, you can check out Catalyst membership. So we're going to launch into today's astrology. And I would say that if I had to pick a word or a phrase to encompass this full moon energy, it would be the word attunement. So my first experience with the concept of attunement and the process of it is actually through my Reiki experience. So when I finished my massage therapy program in 2005, one of my electives was Reiki. You become attuned, your Reiki channel becomes more sensitive, it kind of widens, and you eventually become a master teacher, and that allows you to attune other students as well. And there are healing attunements that allow for the Reiki treatments themselves to be that much more powerful. There are attunements to the different levels of Reiki that allow you to practice with other people, to do distance Reiki, and then to, of course, be able to attune other students. So that was my first experience with the concept and the experience of attunement. Taking that experience and applying it to the energy of this full moon, I would say that this full moon is really about attunement to cosmic forces, the attunement to the overall spiritual implications of anything that you're involved with. And of course, Capricorn is a very serious sign. It is not without its joy and enjoyment, of course, because you are participating and contributing your resources and your labor into an institution or a structure that will last, right? And so I often think about Capricorn in the 10th house. If we're thinking about a plant cycle, for instance, I think about Capricorn as the entire ecosystem itself, right? All of the different living energies plus the soil and the elements all working together to create a balanced ecosystem. You could also think about Capricorn and the 10th house in astrology as an ancient root system that maintains itself. So there is a structure and institutionalization to Capricorn that does bring out this sense of seriousness and responsibility, because at that point, it's not really about just the individual anymore. It actually stopped being about the individual once you hit the 7th house in Libra. And once you get to the 10th house, it's really where all of your personal power is released into something more than yourself. So you're looking at the common good, the welfare of the community, a career or an institution that you are part of, that your works and labors contribute to. And so, mundanely, the 10th house is career, but it's really your professional profile where your power is released, and has to do with the structure of the matrix. And, taking out all of the negative connotations of that we've kind of been force-fed over the last how many decades. It's the idea that there is a structure that we're all feeding into, and that we are contributing ourselves to that does create something that lasts, right? Beyond just the individual. So when I talk about attunement with this full moon and the degree of this full moon, which is 9 degrees Capricorn, an angel carrying a harp, right? So you have a divine or spiritual element with the angel. You have the mechanism of a resonance, of vibration, and that's where the attunement piece comes in. Some general themes here about 9 degrees Capricorn, an angel carrying a harp. It represents the revelation of the spiritual meaning and the purpose at the core of any life situation. Well, what is the opposite of that? Well, the opposite of that is 9 degrees Cancer, which is a small child that is unclothed, very innocent, and kind of bending over a pond and reaching her hand in to catch a fish, right? And it's very naive, it's very innocent, and it is very spontaneous. But it also is something about reaching out with a very pure and unconditioned mind to catch that understanding of life. There's a purity and understanding that comes first with the individual in terms of you have to reach into the waters of your own feeling, grab at that experience. And it is always elusive. If you think about a child that's reaching into a pond to catch a fish, right, they're often not going to do so. But it doesn't mean that they're not going to try. And again, there's this naivety and this innocence about it. And there's nothing very innocent about Capricorn necessarily. It's very adult, it's very responsible, it's very serious, it's very business oriented because it's not just about the individual. There's a lot of growing up that goes along with Capricorn because once you step into a public profile, a professional profile where your power is released, that is the midheaven of the chart, the 10th house cusp, right? The zenith of your life. So it all culminates to this point of Capricorn in the 10th house. And so oftentimes we will not really truly understand the purpose of everything. It's very much part of the emotional internal landscape that is highlighted about the spiritual meaning of life situations, but without the real personal expression that goes along with, kind of taking the expectation out of the situation and having a little bit more innocent approach to kind of reach in and see what we can grab, right? This ever elusive understanding that really is very pure and unconditioned. And I think that that's something that is worth embracing in this full moon in order to fully feel into, the attunement, right? The spiritual meaning at the core of everything. So we started with a new moon in the late degrees of Gemini that was about pruning away all of the things that aren't going to yield. And it's like we've cleared a pathway, we've cleared away all of the extra debris, and now we're really focused, especially because Jupiter has been in Cancer, and that's something we're going to talk about because it's coming into Leo as of tomorrow. Mercury is stationing retrograde in Cancer today. So, of course, the sun is in Cancer now that we have passed our solstice period. So there had been, and there continues to be still, a lot of this Cancer energy that is very rooted and grounded emotionally and stabilized. It is a position where your expansion and your momentum is inward and downward and stabilizing. So we've been there and will continue to be there throughout the sun in Cancer season, and certainly with the Mercury retrograde, it means Mercury is going to be in Cancer for much longer. There is this sense of kind of honing our focus, right? Streamlining it. We've cut away all the unnecessary garbage, basically, the things that are not going to yield. And there's nothing wrong with letting some things kind of expand to see where they're going to go, right? You don't want to just preemptively cut away things before you know for sure they're not going to yield. And so at this point, we're working with that. And we've already kind of, I think, established where those things are not going to yield anything fruitful. And now with this full moon, now that we've kind of wiped away or cut away all of that stuff, it kind of leaves us some room to be like, wow, what's next? Right? I don't really know. I know that there is this pond in front of me. I know that there's something in there that I want to have, or I want to grab, or I want to interact with, but I don't know exactly what it is. Things are kind of murky, right? I'm just going to reach in and see what I can find and what I can pull up and be completely unconditioned. And in that process, I feel like that's where the attunement really comes from. If we are blocking ourselves or we have all of these expectations, about how it's supposed to be, or we don't think anything is in there that's going to be fruitful or be worth investing ourselves into, then, we're not going to really be able to see the full picture. And I feel like that this Capricorn full moon is really about kind of reminding us to keep that innocent and pure perspective as we move through, especially the next couple of months, because we're going to be finishing up the eclipse cycle. We're going to be going through the Lion's Gate. And we're going to, start a new eclipse cycle and move through the second half of the Fire Horse year. And for those of you who did have the Fire Horse reading, you know that this is the time period where the stuff that had been much more under the surface, right? Kind of like in the pond, for instance, under the surface is presenting itself now. It's externalized now. And that's something that I said months ago when I did the Fire Horse reading, that things that were going to be happening then were going to start surfacing around this time and externalize themselves. So maybe some things you planned or even just made intentions for months ago, like February, maybe they're starting to actually be externalized now. They're starting to surface. Maybe it is something that you can grab. Maybe something has come to fruition that you had already put into place, and now it is externalizing, and it's a good thing, right? So these are all the positive attributes of what is going to be, especially in this 2 weeks, because there's going to be a lot of shifting, and we're going to look at those things in the chart. So can you embrace that purity and understanding? Can you really identify with being more innocent and spontaneous in terms of reaching in and grabbing or attempting to embrace something that feels really elusive? Because in that process, this is where I think the innocence and the unconditioned response is where the spiritual meaning of the whole process is going to reveal itself to all of us. And that's where I feel like attunement comes from. Because when you have those awakening moments, or you become attuned to the next level, if you want to think about that, if you become attuned to a new frequency, for instance, right? This is what happens in Reiki. You become attuned to it to begin with, and then everything around you starts shifting and changing to be in resonance with that new attunement as well. But you have to have like I said, this unconditioned kind of pure understanding to just reach in and see what you can come up with. Without that, there is no attunement, and there certainly isn't the ability to be like, I can really see the full spiritual picture of everything that's been happening. So because there's a lot of things that are about to shift, and they're about to, again, be more externalized. They're going to be a lot more masculine energy, and some things are going to start being revealed because Neptune is going to station retrograde during this time. So I'm going to pull up the chart, and we're going to start going through some of the major astrological things that are going to be happening over the next 2 weeks. All right. So this is our January. I keep talking about January. By the way, this degree of Capricorn, 9 degrees Capricorn, is roughly, very roughly, I haven't gone back and looked at it exactly, but I can count, roughly around the New Year's Eve time, like on the calendar, right? December 31st into January 1st is roughly about 9-10 degrees Capricorn. So that's the other thing too, is that emotionally, internally, subconsciously, maybe in your dream state perhaps, there may be an indication here of how things are going to be much more on the surface come December into January as well. And right now, there is a necessity to be aligned with or identified with that pure, spontaneous, kind of innocent perspective, because by the time we get to Capricorn season, end of December into January, the spiritual meaning of all of what's happening at this time will become something not only just revealed, but it'll be something that we identify with, right? Because the sun represents that personal self-expression. So this is the chart for actually midnight on the 29th Eastern Standard Time. There's a lot of bold lines on this chart indicating that there's a lot of foundational support with the blue lines. Of course, the sextiles represent transformational energy. And then the red lines, the squares and oppositions, are always the places where we grow the most. And there's certainly going to be plenty of those. But already, as you can see here, and you may already know, Mars is just freshly into Gemini. Mars and Jupiter just had that sextile. They were both at their last degrees of a feminine sign, right? So Taurus and Cancer. These are yin energies, water and earth. They have a feminine quality, so they're passive, they're receptive, they are not outward and action oriented. Both of these energies, Mars and Jupiter, which by the way, they rule fire signs, both of them, are about to move into masculine, outwardly projecting energies. Mars is moving into Gemini, and Jupiter's moving into Leo. So if you thought Venus in Leo was main character syndrome, and it is to a certain extent, she is the leading lady when she is in Leo, but it has a lot more to do with what we value and kind of putting that at the center of our experience. When Jupiter comes in, I mean, this is true main character syndrome with Jupiter, because Jupiter's already kind of like, I'm the main character anyway. Coming into Leo, it's going to be that much more bold, expressive, expansive, and there's going to be a Jupiter-Sun conjunction in Leo this month as well, and we'll talk about that later because it's going to be happening in the next lunar cycle. But it's with those two energies moving into masculine signs, you know, things are going to be much more expressive outwardly with Mars and Gemini. They're going to be much more, passionate and bold in our creative expression and our authenticity with Jupiter. And Jupiter is all about the big picture. It's very benefic. There is a lot of good luck and fortune that is related to Jupiter, especially when it rules Sagittarius. But it also can be bordering on conceit and very inflamed by an ego. So it's going to be important too to keep that in mind. So things are about to, with Mars and Jupiter moving into Leo, Mars moving into Gemini, things, like I said, they're going to be more outwardly expressive. They're going to be a lot more bold and passionate and expansive into this combust energy. So you're going to feel that things are going to probably like pull you along in this way, or you yourself are going to feel much more bold and expressive and projecting yourself into your words and your communication as we go through the weeks and certainly the rest of, I would say, this season, right? Which is from June solstice to September equinox. So Mars is already in Gemini. So one of the big things is that it's going to meet Uranus on the 4th of July, which is very volatile in Gemini, but it actually is at a degree, and I don't want to get ahead of myself here, but I'm going to just roll with it. It's at a degree that represents a kind of nostalgia, that there is a longing to return to a pre-intellectual state. Now, that could be triggered by some sort of event that puts us back into that place of, I wish I didn't have to think about these things, right? There's a nostalgia for, like I said, pre-intellectual state of consciousness, right? Where you're kind of returning to traditional archetypes and a source material that is before you start really crunching the numbers, so to speak, in your own head, like actually working with the data and the information you're receiving and then processing it as well, right? That Gemini give and take and back and forth. So Mars and Uranus, I mean, that is naturally a volatile energy. It'll be a volatile mental energy. So information, communication, the nervous system being very, very amplified and triggered with Mars and Uranus conjunct like this. But it also can be in a positive way, right? I feel like because it's the 250th anniversary of the US, because there's been so much positive press with the World Cup being held here and so many people from Europe and other countries that are sponsoring teams to come play in the World Cup, having so much positive press about the people in the United States, the patriotism and just the love of country is likely to be elevated and to be experienced on the 4th of July at the 250th anniversary. It could also be a longing for a state that is before we kind of start branching off or splitting from each other and taking these opposing positions or these dichotomous positions, right? Being in contention and contrast. So there could be something positive about this. It is volatile. Mars and Uranus conjunct like this, certainly. I mean, you have to expect making very rash decisions or being very hasty or just really rapid fire. But I also feel like that there's the possibility that experience is going to heighten people, possibly in a very positive way. There is a sense of purity and understanding, of innocence, of spontaneity. And I think this transit might actually feed into that nostalgia for something that is unconditioned in terms of cultural whatever on top of it. It could be also very heightened in a negative way too. So we're going to have to see how it unfolds. But with everything else surrounding it, it does feel like that it can be a very positive thing. But let's look at today, because I also want to point out some other things that are going to be coming around the corner here. So Mercury in Cancer is also stationing retrograde today. And so it'll move back to, gosh, I can't even remember anymore. It's on different notes, but it'll retrograde for its normal 2 to 3 weeks in Cancer and then station direct and will come out of shadow at this point. And I think it's going to be more like August when it comes out of shadow, which makes sense because that's going to be when the eclipse cycle turns over, the Lion's Gate, all of that stuff. And this is very close to the degree that Jupiter and Venus were at their conjunction at 26 degrees Cancer. So Mercury is stationing retrograde at 26 to 27 degrees Cancer. And it's very interesting to have Mercury stationing retrograde as Mars is coming into its home territory. So I also feel like, too, that while Mercury is now going into review mode, especially about our feelings, especially about how we feel about our home, our family, or our traditions, where we're emotionally rooted, all of those Cancerian themes. And it is very much based on how we feel. As that is now stationing to retrograde, Mars is pushing forward in terms of our communication, the exchange of information, right? Projecting ourselves through our communication. So this is kind of tricky territory, I think, with Mercury in its retrograde. We've learned a lot already, and it's not that we can't, with some boldness and some courage, really speak out, right? Or share our perspective or communicate or listen, right? Mars is not a great listener, but Mercury in retrograde is a great listener. So there may be some communication stuff. There may be some, people kind of spitting it out, so to speak. And it might be positive. It may not be. Hopefully it's just truthful and authentic. But Mercury in its retrograde in Cancer, I feel like the actual mechanism of our consciousness is going to be more willing to listen. More willing to listen, more willing to reconsider all of the static values, may have undergone some sort of catharsis somewhat recently, right? I feel like that is happening. So those things kind of seem like they're not really going to fit together, but Mars, when it was in conjunction with the Pleiades, was in a sextile to Mercury, actually. So that was kind of the perfect moment, really, to find the place where you can transform those energies. So Mercury stationing retrograde today before the Capricorn full moon, and it's in the sign opposite of Capricorn. So there's still lots to work on still, or at least be aware of when it comes to those personal roots and where they're planted and how we feel about them and how strong they are. And we've had a lot of time to really deeply consider, to feel into, and maybe to communicate our feelings, right? Or to express our feelings about these things. And maybe there's been some sort of cathartic moment that is going to force us to reconsider those things as well. So going to be a little tricky with Mars and Gemini. It's just going to be spitting, right? Spitting the truth or whatever, just being very bold and maybe even rash about what we're communicating. So Mars and Gemini is not much of a listener, but Mercury in Cancer, especially retrograde, very much is. And so maybe there's things that need to be said, but there's also things that need to be heard, and there needs to be a listening. And again, that's part of being the pure and unconditioned perspective of where this full moon is, where the sun is, right? The sun in Cancer. Innocent, spontaneous, culturally unconditioned. And if you can really embrace that, then the Mercury retrograde, I think, is going to be very useful moving forward, just because you're open and willing to reconsidering those values or reconsidering those cultural constraints that maybe kind of just got taken away. And now there is a cathartic kind of reorientation around those things. So let's keep moving forward, because there's a lot that's going to happen really quickly. Tomorrow, the 30th, speaking of Mars, it's going to T-square the nodes, and this is a very karmic axis. This is a mental crossroads, and on top of that is when Jupiter enters Leo. And all I put down on my notes was, same thing I already said. If you thought Venus in Leo was main character syndrome, just wait. I personally have Jupiter in Leo, so I'm having a Jupiter return. This is this is going to be one of those times where you get to be the main character without it taking up too much space, right? Jupiter in Leo is definitely going to man spread, right? And so sometimes, though, it's important that you take up space. And I think that anybody who's got Jupiter in Leo and is having this Jupiter return during this time, it might actually be the right time to start expanding and taking up space and letting your light shine, especially if you're a Sag person, right? Because Jupiter is your ruling planet. So boy, oh boy. Now, it's not going to come without its challenges. Right away, Jupiter is going to square Chiron, and it's going to come into a quincunx with the North Node. So there will be checks and balances along the way, I assure you. Mars T-square the nodes, right? So Uranus already did this at the beginning of June, and so many people had so many gut punches and crazy things that happened. So this is a little less disruptive in that way, because Uranus really does just like, flip the script on everybody, and it's often unexpected. Mars in a T-square to the nodes is, like I said, it's a mental crossroads. So there is tension that has to do with the Virgo energy, which is often very overanalyzing and very controlling of our own personal energies and our resources and our habits. And the North Node, really surrendering to the flow and trusting the unknown. So Mars drives how we take action. And in Gemini, especially about communication and asserting ourselves through that communication. So there's a lot of mind racing with Mars in Gemini, of course, right? You're going to feel really squirrely. Your mental energy is going to just be moving very rapidly. There might be a restless urge to engage in those types of mental pursuits like researching or speaking. And you might feel your energy scattered in a lot of directions, right? And then you have the karmic axis of the nodes, which are getting pretty much at 0 degrees of Pisces and Virgo. So things are getting really distilled down to their essence when it comes to the nodal axis, which is the trajectory of our soul from where we've been, which is south, to where we are going, which is north. It's our evolutionary path. The south node is going to pull us back to what we already know, what we feel safe doing. And so micromanaging, maybe endless editing, all of those kind of very critical, control-y type of things with Virgo. Not that those things aren't important, but the North Node in Pisces is like you really do have to surrender to the divine plan because it's so much more than your own personal mind and analysis could ever really wrap our heads around, right? It comes from the connection through our soul. So the North Node calls us to surrender, to trust the bigger picture, and embrace the unknown without needing every single step planned out perfectly. So you Virgo people, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And a lot of times that need to plan everything is really just a way of dealing with our anxiety. And that does have its place when you want to account for feeling out of control. But this nodal axis for the last year and a half has been really testing our ability to just surrender to the bigger picture here. And this T-square, just like with Uranus, Mars is the trigger for this axis, right? And it creates that point of crisis. And so there may be a pressure to kind of think and analyze your way out of a situation that actually requires us to just be still and quiet so that we can tap into our intuition. Or maybe you're trapped in some sort of perfectionism and you can't actually see the big picture because you're so caught up in the details. The mystery is just as important here as knowing how everything is going to go. And I know that that's a lot of people's issues and has been for years now about like, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? What's going to happen? And I know too that oftentimes we don't leave space for the divine to enter into our life because we close ourselves off because we want to be able to control every aspect or we want to know what's going on. And the mystery is such a huge part of the experience. So this T-square is just going to bring this back up. And it's not Uranus anymore, so it's not something that's going to come out of nowhere and flip the script. It's really going to be us that is going to keep trying to push into this. And 0 degrees Gemini is the glass bottom boat. Our own consciousness can act as the barrier, right? To being able to see the fullness of the whole ocean, so to speak, without being consumed by it. However, you have to actually allow your soul to lead you. And there is this element of like trying to put up that barrier Maybe Mars is just going to break through that glass bottom, and that might be what is necessary for some people. Other people, maybe it's recognizing that there is that barrier, but that also allows you to tap into your intuition without being consumed or subsumed by the medium. So that's going to be pretty interesting. I think it'll probably be much more of a personalized experience of us just feeling that point of crisis and just restlessness to speak something. Maybe something needs to be communicated. Maybe we're feeling really an urge to communicate and try to control a situation. And this is going to challenge us to maybe just let the mystery lead in this case. And that maybe there are aspects about a situation that we don't fully know because we still have a barrier between us and the rest of the ocean, if that makes sense. And then you have Jupiter coming into Leo. And I'll tell you, that first degree of Leo is my 7th house cusp. I know it well. And it is the blood rushing to your head. It is the Kundalini activating. And so Jupiter in that position, it's just going to get really expansive very quickly. Jupiter will have its checks and balances. So let's move on to Jupiter, because on the first, it's going to square the Chiron that is newly in Taurus, and then it's going to, speaking of the North Node, it's going to come into an inconjunct or a quincunx to the North Node. So in galactic astrology, these 0 degrees are the cracks between the worlds, right? These are really potent and very distilled energies at 0 degrees of all the signs, okay? So coming into Leo, it's going to be very Leo. It's just going to take up so much space. So the square to Chiron, first of all, is going to create friction between that desire for bold self-expression and the need to address our underlying feelings of instability, financial anxiety, all of these Taurus things, bodily insecurity. Oh boy. That conversation is really going to start coming up, I think, with Chiron and Taurus, because, Taurus is fixed earth. It is the objective reality that we live within. It is the medium of our growth, but it also is something that is not easily changeable. It's not mutable. It's not cardinal. It is fixed earth. People are just going to have to start coming to terms with their bodies as they are, right? And yes, those things are malleable to a certain extent, but there are some things that are not. And then also the financial anxiety and instability in general. So this square is going to challenge us to grow and to expand without ignoring those fundamental things, right? Especially the wounding around that, It's going to force us to contend with that wound and not be deterred from growing and expanding in our own authenticity, if that makes sense, right? And so there is a tendency with Jupiter, no matter what, to overdo it. So there could be overspending, there could be showing off in order to project confidence and to mask internal securities. Oof. I could see that, absolutely. You're going to see that probably on the internet more than anything. But you'll see it in your personal life. You may be experiencing it yourself. Growth versus comfort, right? So the Jupiter and Leo aspect is the big dramatic leaps. But at the same time, Chiron and Taurus is going to be like, practicality, be slow and steady, push to expand creatively, yet forced to confront how grounded we really are, right? It's just going to keep bringing these themes back to us. And so it really highlights how maybe our daily habits or our lifestyle might be compensating for deeper emotional issues, especially around all of those Taurus themes. And if you have a Chiron in Taurus, which many of us do, especially in that Gen X millennial area, and especially millennials who have Pluto and Scorpio, which are most of them, it's going to be really hard, I think. But it's going to also be the most healing, because when you have Pluto in the chart, ultimately the soul is looking for that Pluto opposition, right? And so that would be Pluto and Taurus for the millennials. So the Chiron aspect is going to be healing the unhealed stuff that then will allow the millennial generation to find empowerment within. But there's going to be a lot of healing that needs to happen first. And boy, I'm getting some huge heart chakra stuff right now. So just be aware of that. So Jupiter square Chiron, that's going to bring it right to the surface. And then on top of that, which is the third, Jupiter is going to be in an inconjunct. Ooh, let's go back to that. Hold on. This grand trine right here, that actually looks like a kite. I think it is a kite because it's the nodes of the moon. It's Chiron in Taurus. It's Lilith, right? There's a kite. There's a 0 degree kite happening all around with Lilith and Capricorn. It's almost in Capricorn. And so kites, of course, are aspects where the opposition is the spine of the kite, and everything surrounding it is the stabilizing and transformative energy that allows you to fly. But you need the opposition. And in this case, the opposition is a natural opposition of the nodes of Virgo and Pisces as well. So that's going to be in between Jupiter square Chiron and then the next day. So again, the evolutionary path of trying to micromanage everything versus surrendering to the flow of things is the spine of the kite. Then you have Jupiter that is at 0 degrees Leo that's going to quincunx or inconjunct the north node. Inconjunct is when we feel a lot of internal lack of balance or cohesion, right? There are two things that won't fit together. And so you have to actually find that balance within yourself, because externally there are two aspects that are not going to fit. And so it pits your desire for that dramatic ego-driven recognition, right? The Jupiter and Leo against your soul's need for spiritual surrender. There may be this confidence with Jupiter and Leo that clashes with this demand almost for humility, right? And so don't let your grand vision alienate the people you're trying to help. And that can happen, I think, a lot, especially Jupiter in Leo. You lose the meaning of it all in Leo if you let the Leo part take total control. So you can integrate these energies by using your voice to champion your cause, channeling this energy into some sort of, theatrical flair, into compassionate storytelling or a spiritual art or charitable leadership, that kind of stuff. So embrace the pivot is one phrase that I found online. You may feel a sense of restlessness or unease during this, so use this friction to rethink how you balance your personal light and your spiritual focus. There's just a lot of difficult energy right out the gate. So let's recap real quick. Mercury stations retrograde today on the full moon. Tomorrow, Mars is in a T-square to the nodes, and Jupiter comes into Leo. The first, Jupiter squares Chiron. The second, there is a kite with the nodes of the moon, Chiron, and Lilith, which is a moment of like, okay, this tension with the nodes is actually what we need in order to transcend the situation as it is and heal, right? And come into a place where we really embrace the power that we have. The third is when Jupiter has that quincunx with the north node, and it's pitting our desire for that recognition against the need for spiritual surrender, and finding the place within ourselves where those two things can exist at the same time without feeling uneasy. And then, of course, we get to July 4th, which is where Mars and Uranus come into their conjunction, and it's very volatile. Like I said, it's electric, it's fast-paced, and especially Gemini. So we're definitely talking about the nervous system. It supercharges your drive for freedom and pushes you to act impulsively, speak your mind without a filter, and make sudden, very radical decisions. Okay? And that's the thing about Gemini too. You make choices. You're presented with options and you make choices. So you may feel restless, and it might be an urge to break free from something restricting. And maybe that urge to break free is a good thing. That's happening on the 4th of July. And then right after, Mars is in a sextile to Neptune. Mars is going to be making big transits with the outer planets at 5 degrees Gemini, which is Neptune and Pluto. Uranus is going to come into this degree as well. And this degree is a revolutionary magazine asking for action. Okay? You can kind of get an idea of what type of energy this represents. Here is, if you remember this from months ago, the mystic triangle. It's back with Pluto and Neptune, and this time with Mars, right? This is one of those moments that's like, oh, there's some big changes happening with this mystic triangle. So the sextile with Mars and Neptune, first of all, is a really kind of like ideal window for chasing creative passions, allowing your intuition to guide your mental drive, your physical drive. And are you putting this energy towards something that is spiritually meaningful, something that allows you to transcend where you've been, right? Neptune in Aries, it might be transcending where we have been as a humanity through the process of like revolting against what has been, right? The revolutionary magazine asking for action is kind of one of those forced tipping points with Gemini from one position to another. So the sextile to Neptune is kind of one of those blending your inspired action, which is Neptune and Aries, with this mental agility. So you might find your words and ideas carrying very compelling quality in this moment, right after it meets Uranus and has this very volatile and electric energy and really just charges you to push through restrictions. And then you have this sextile to Neptune that's just feeling very almost magical and very compelling in the way that you speak and the information that you are working with. Right after this on the 5th, as you can see here, the next part of the mystic triangle is the trine with Mars and retrograde Pluto. So again, there's a lot of deep psychological insight here when you're talking about Mars in Gemini and Pluto in Aquarius. These are mental signs, air signs, the ability to influence others through your words. So there's going to be a lot of that. Now, when you have a purity and understanding, sometimes that can make you really susceptible and impressionable. And so that's something I would caution against. Not to say that you should close yourself off from that openness and that innocence, but also, too, that the reason that we are allowing ourselves into that space is in order to be open to being attuned to the spiritual meaning of the whole process, right? And so you don't want to just leave yourself completely open to that influence. But this ultimately is very harmonious because it empowers you, again, to break free of old mental patterns. That really starts, I think, with the T-square with Mars and the nodes and just keeps on going, and it really kind of reaches this peak over 4th of July weekend. So there's breakthroughs psychologically, there's strategic communication, right? So sometimes this type of transit, especially Mars and Gemini, is going to give you a really strong ability to persuade, to investigate, to read between the lines maybe, and your words carry a lot of weight. So, and problem solving, innovative problem solving, right? Because Gemini is very adaptable, Aquarius is very forward thinking, and just keep in mind that Pluto is retrograde. So a lot of this is about our internal process right now as opposed to the outer process with Pluto in Aquarius. Now, we're coming up on our 3rd quarter here. So the next major transit is the Sun is going to square Saturn. And as you can see, as that's happening, it's going to be opposite Lilith. So there's actually a T-square with the Sun and Lilith and Saturn. And Lilith is actually in Capricorn, which is the home territory of Saturn as well. So this is going to really carry a lot of weight, in my opinion, as well. So let's see here. This T-square, as you can see, Lilith, Saturn, the Sun conjunct Sirius. So, this is clearly a big Syrian starseed activation, and also Lyran, right? This is the degree of Vega. So there's a big starseed activation, and 14 degrees Aries is the head of Andromeda. So this is a big one, actually. Difficult tension in order to force the growth, right? So the ultimate goal of a T-square is to find an outlet. And oftentimes, the best way to do that is to find the ghost point. So, of course, in this situation, the ghost point would be 15 Libra. So this particular alignment kind of pushes you to stop denying your vulnerabilities, which is, Cancer, and to start building resilience on what is actually authentic to you. And there's something about 15 degrees Libra, which is an interesting degree. It's about these circular paths. You just keep coming back around again and again. And I think there's something to that in terms of tapping into what's already happened and tapping into the actual rhythm of coming back around that I get a sense is going to help with this T-square. Now, when we get to the 7th, which is our 3rd quarter moon, with the moon in Aries, right? So the moon is pretty much going to be conjunct Saturn. The moon conjuncting Saturn is going to make us very emotionally responsible. We'll become very focused and determined. And 15 degrees Aries is about weaving the blanket of our own desire, right? Actually doing the work of weaving the blanket that we surround ourselves with, potentiating our desire. So we have the T-square, and then right after the moon comes in and makes it that much more emotionally palpable, especially in Aries, which oftentimes will be very flashpoint temper-wise. But when it meets Saturn, it's going to be kind of like very determined, very patient, and stern. It's really going to ground what otherwise I feel like would be a very, like I said, flashpoint emotionally with a moon in Aries. So, what is a third quarter square? It's a crisis in consciousness. We have to be aware, I think, of our capacity to responsibly potentiate our own desires. In fact, we are the only ones responsible for doing that. That's nobody else's responsibility in this lifetime. We're the ones that have to do that. So that third quarter moon is going to bring those themes up. And then especially about attunement to the potency of the invisible forces of nature. So again, it kind of goes back to this idea that we as humans attempt to control and micromanage everything about our experience. And there's so much energy surrounding us. It's about being in relationship with nature, with God, with natural forces, with our own higher self that really is how we integrate ourselves into this experience. So that's going to come up, I think, with the third quarter moon. It's the same day that Neptune stations retrograde. So that is usually a period when the fog clears and the house lights come up, right? You're like, oh, that's a set, because otherwise you are completely in the experience when Neptune is moving direct, right? The smoke and mirrors of it all, right? That's part of the fun of it. That's part of the experience. When that all goes away, you have to actually look at the glaring reality. And that is going to be difficult in some cases. Other cases, I think it's going to be like, okay, I see where I thought this was real, and now I'm seeing that it's not. You see where your pitfalls are, but you also see where your potential is as well. Neptune's going to be retrograde for months, so we're going to have lots of time having the fog clear on all of this early Aries energy that Neptune has been working with. On the 9th, Venus enters Virgo. Right? You can see here that she is moving through the last degrees of Leo. It's going to pass Regulus. Well, it's actually going to conjunct Regulus at the South Node and then move into Virgo. So she has gone from being the center of her own experience to now doing the work, right? Because that's what Virgo is. It's doing the work. It's doing the work that is necessary in order to bring forward the fruits of our labor. And so she becomes basically like a pregnant mama with Venus in Virgo, right? Gestating the life within her. And so she gets very, very serious, very focused, very disciplined. And, of course, meeting the South Node, it kind of pulls us back into what we already know, which is that, editing and controlling of details and micromanaging potentially. But it's also about being able to see the forest for the trees. And that's important too. We have to embrace where we've been so that we know where we're going, right? So we know where we're coming out of. And Venus coming into Virgo and meeting the South Node is going to be a big part of that. And it's going to trine Chiron right at the same time. Chiron is in Venus's home territory. So this is going to be a very stable, healing moment of seeing the forest for the trees and then understanding, what the wounding around insecurity, financial stuff, your own body, your own physicality, realizing that that's not everything, right? That you actually have the capacity to take those resources and put them to work, which is what Virgo and the 6th house is all about. So that trine with Chiron, I think, is going to be very look at how much power I actually do have, right? There are things I can't change right now, but there are things that I can put to work with what is. And Venus trine Chiron and meeting the South Node, I think, is going to be very instrumental in showing us that. The 11th is when Chiron and the nodes, and I've talked about this months ago too, because this is a big one. Chiron and the nodes are going to be in an aspect. So the North Node will be in a sextile with Chiron, both at 0 degrees, right? It's a very powerful opportunity to align the soul's spiritual evolution with the healing of these very earthly and material wounds with Chiron and Taurus. Finding peace, this is really what it feels like, finding peace with that wounding, with that pain, right? The material, the physical, the financial stuff. Finding peace with all of that is, in fact, the catalyst for unlocking our spiritual purpose. Wow, I'm getting like a full body hit right here on that. So, and this takes us through most of this lunar cycle, right? And this, I think is the most successful if we start out with, again, going back to the sun at the full moon and where it'll be exact, which is 9 degrees Cancer, about being spontaneous and innocent and, the culturally unconditioned kind of desire to quest for knowledge, right? With that 9 degrees of Cancer. And so when you are willing to be more innocent about it and allow yourself to feel the full picture, then as we go through all these different elements through the next 2 weeks of Chiron and the nodes of the moon and the connection to Mars and the connection to Jupiter and everything, it's going to be very healing. And I really feel this finding peace with these wounds is going to be the catalyst for unlocking the spiritual purpose. And that's a difficult thing to swallow in a lot of cases, but wow, it's also so liberating, right? When you're able to embrace that suffering or embrace that process of healing and realize that that is what is, projecting us forward evolutionarily. Right after that, we have a Mercury Cazimi in Cancer. And on the 13th, right before, so we're at a balsamic moon, number 1, on the 13th, and getting ready for our Cancer new moon. So, and while this is updating, oh, there it is. I was going to just share with you what's happening, but what we're going to see is that Venus is going to make some really challenging connections to the larger transpersonal planets. So Venus in Virgo is going to then come into a square with Uranus, which is now at the degree I talked about of the Revolutionary magazine asking for action. So here's Venus in Virgo moving to come into that square with Uranus. And then also, too, it's going to create a yod with Pluto and Neptune, both retrograde. So first, this square, right? First, the square to Uranus. The mutable square, by the way, Virgo and Gemini. So, there's sudden shifts. And the 5 degrees Virgo is, Sabian symbol-wise, a man becomes aware of nature spirits and normally unseen spiritual agencies. So again, it takes us back to being aware of things that we normally don't interact with in our conscious minds, something that is more than us, but is absolutely surrounding us, okay? So yes, there's sudden shifts in love and friendship when you have Venus square Uranus, creative and financial curveballs, nervous energy, impulsivity. But I would say that the square here and really the meticulous nature of Virgo in general is going to clash with Gemini that wants to be free, right? And the meticulous controlling nature of Virgo is really about, at this point, realizing that there's more to it than just going from one state to another. It's going to prompt that sudden desire to break free from stagnation, but Venus in Virgo is kind of making us aware that there's way more going on here than we previously may have thought or felt or seen. And then you do get that nervous energy and impulsivity. So again, acting purely on impulse and causing misunderstanding could definitely be part of this as well. But it also could be a sudden windfall or a sudden experience. And you might find yourself wanting to abandon something that you've been meticulously planning. So something more stimulating, something more vivid, something more spontaneous. It's not necessarily a bad thing. That might actually be what is meant to happen when you become aware of the fact that there's more going on here than what you had previously thought or even acted upon, right? Or you were aware of. And so that might actually be the thing that stimulates that breaking free from that stagnation or stimulating some sort of change in something that you had been planning out meticulously. And you're like, you know what? I'm just going to do something completely different, something more stimulating, something that something really spontaneous. There it comes again with the word spontaneous. The thing, though, is the yod. So the finger of God that's pointing to Venus in Virgo at the very same degree. So it's like a shifting passage that requires a lot of patience. That's what a yod feels like. So if a certain path or dynamic feels blocked, step back, reevaluate things, and allow the pieces to fall into place organically rather than trying to force them. And that's very difficult with Venus and Virgo because our value and worth is all wrapped up in how things are organized and how they are controlled, basically. So there's a tension between ground and routines, everyday routines. What do you do on the daily? How do you work? So it's grounding these everyday routines and managing much larger transpersonal ideas that are very internalized, right? You're talking about Neptune and Pluto in its retrograde. So I feel like that's a square with Uranus as we come into the balsamic moon phase is, going to really trigger people into reevaluating what they've been doing, what they've been planning on, where their values are in terms of their works, their labors, their services, all those Virgo types of themes. What are you bringing to fruition? This yod and specifically with this square to Uranus, that's going to be the trigger. And then you have the yod that's going to be like, whoa, maybe I need to step back and reevaluate. So you might feel that by the end of this lunar cycle, you might feel that nervous energy, that impulsivity. And I'm not saying that in some instances, maybe that isn't necessarily a bad thing to be like, you know what, let's just scrap it. Not necessarily start over, but just put your energy somewhere else. But I would say that with this yod as well, that it is important to maybe step back and reevaluate first and let things fall into place. This goes along with the North Node in Pisces very well, where you are trusting the divine source, you are in surrender to the mystery and surrendering to the flow of it and letting things shake out organically rather than trying to control every single aspect of what's going on, right? And you may not even be able to fully control yourself. And I feel a lot of that too, that there is going to be a lot of situations where things are going to come out of people's mouth that they're not even trying to control, and it's going to have an impact one way or the other, especially something like Venus square Uranus, right? You may feel a sudden urge to speak without a filter or act purely on impulse, right? That is going to have consequences too. So the yod, it feels like it's going to create more tension, but it also is kind of force us to be like, okay, maybe we need to take a step back and reevaluate and let things fall into place naturally rather than trying to force them. And then we have our new moon on July 14th, which will be in Cancer, 21 degrees, 59 minutes. So you're looking at 22 degrees Cancer, which is a young woman waiting for a sailboat. Oh, that's going to be fun. That'll be fun. That is very much I am leaving myself open to the arrival of my dreams, basically, right? Or the vessel that is going to take me to where I want to be, right? So, but this energy, all since the new moon in Gemini, is about not only cutting away everything that is not going to yield, but allowing ourselves the innocence and the spontaneity and the purity to really reach out for something brand new or something that seems elusive, but it really isn't. It's just new, it's unconditioned, but we have to allow that to actually happen. And there's lots of things along the way that are going to kind of force us into that place if we're not already doing it. So, all right, friends, I'm going to leave it there for this full moon forecast. Thank you so much for being here. I truly appreciate all of you so very much. Yeah, if you're interested in a reading, energy work, any of that stuff, you can just go to my website. It's linked in the description box below. Interested in Catalyst membership, that is, you get 2 energy readings a month. Astro Vibe check-ins on a regular basis, short form content that goes right to the membership page about the daily astrology, some things that come up. That's for members only. And then if you're premium membership, then you get your own personal reading, one-on-one or energy work every month. So thanks, everyone. I appreciate you all there so very much. And I'll see you on the next forecast. Bye.